This is the second of our Take One Author lessons, and today we're going to look at the necessary parts of a sentence. We're going to really learn to really be sure what makes a sentence an actual sentence, and not just some really interesting words that happen to be together, but that don't quite make sense. I think I'll probably do this over two lessons, because there's two different problems we've been seeing in your books before we broke up. There was the interesting sets of words, but they weren't enough of them to actually make a sentence fully make sense. And then there was what I'll do next lesson, which was the incredibly long selections of words that were really interesting and had all the right bits, but were probably three, four, or even five sentences that would all run together. Today we're going to deal with those little bits that aren't quite a sentence. So let's talk about the basics of a sentence to begin with. I actually couldn't find a totally basic, simple sentence in this book because, in general, authors don't use them that much. When they do, they're using them for effect. They stand out because they're strange. They use them to be punchy. But anyway, here we go. The captain grabbed a sausage. This is a pretty simple sentence. It could just be the captain grabbed. That's about as short as we could get it. Or if his name was Captain, it could just be Captain grabbed. Because we need a few bits to our sentence. Well, first of all, we need to have this. Now, this, as I'm sure you know, is a noun. It's a person, place, or thing. In this case, it's this person down here. But because there is more than one captain, not necessarily on the ship, but in the world, captain isn't his name, captain is what he is. It's a type of thing. So we also need this. This is a determiner. Okay. So this noun, this determiner and this noun together are acting as a noun phrase. They're telling us who this story is about. Well, not the story, sorry, who this sentence is about. And in this case, the sentence is about the captain. There is another noun phrase here. There's a sausage. The sausage features in my sentence, but the sentence is not about the sausage. The sausage is not the subject. This is the subject. This is just an object. And it's not because the captain's alive and the sausage is not. It's because the sentence is telling us who is doing the thing. The subject is the person that's doing, or the object, or the, sorry, object's not a good word. The subject is the noun that is doing the thing, and the doing of the thing is this word here. This is the verb. The verb is the thing that is happening in this sentence. And what is happening? Well, there's some grabbing going on. So this very basic sentence has got a subject, the captain, doing something, a verb, grabbing, and in this case, to something else, an object, which is the sausage. The captain grabbed a sausage. This is a pretty simple sentence. It's not got any expanded, it hasn't got any prepositional phrases or adverbial phrases. It doesn't have any extra clauses. It doesn't have any conjunctions in it. It doesn't have all of those other things that we'd use on, on a day-to-day basis in so many of our sentences. It's pretty simple. It's pretty short. We can tell it's a sentence. It has a capital letter at the beginning and it has a full stop at the end. So to make our sentence a sentence, it needs to have a subject. It needs to have a verb. Now that would on its own would make it a clause, but to make it an actual sentence, it needs a capital and it needs a full stop. In this case, it has also got an object, noun. Quite often a verb needs something else to do it with. So you can talk to another person, you can pick up a plate, you can a lot of the nouns, a lot of the verbs, sorry, need a second thing to interact with. We could just say the captain grabbed, but you would be left there thinking, brilliant, I'm imagining him doing some grabbing motion, but it'd be nice to know what he was grabbing. So, the captain grabbed a sausage. Subject noun, verb, object. There's a joke here, but I might tell it to you at the end rather than spoil the flow of this. So, our basics of a sentence, we've gone over this a few times already this school year, and I think we should probably have this pretty sorted. And you're pretty good if I give you a basic sentence like this of making sure it's got a capital and a full stop. It gets complicated when other stuff starts to appear. There are other things that we've been adding as year fours to sentences. Now, this is a sentence actually from the book. The crew looked around in fear and dread as visions of monsters filled their heads. And there they are in the picture, with visions of monsters filling their heads. There's two kind of bits to this sentence. There's the crew looked around in fear and dread, and then it's as visions of monsters filled their head, because we've got as acting like a conjunction, joining two clauses together. We've got the crew looked around in fear and dread, and we've got visions of monsters filled their heads. And we put as to join the two together. As is actually part of this one. And we could arrange this sentence as visions of monsters filled their heads, the crew looked around in fear and dread. It would work just as well if we swapped it over. Who's it about? The subject, the crew, for this first clause. In fact, that will be red, the crew. Verb, what are they doing? They're looking around, to be specific. What's the second bit of this about? It's about visions of monsters. And what's it doing? It's filling their head. In this case, you don't say the crew again because we've already said the crew once. There must mean the crew because it's not the monsters. So there we've got our basics again. This time we've got two of them joined together using a conjunction. But we've also got this in fear and dread. We've got this prepositional phrase. Now, it gets very hard in year four. People throw a lot of different things at you. Adverbial phrases and prepositional phrases probably come up there the most. You need to use these things. You will use these things. You naturally use these things. We tell you what they're called, A, because we have to, and B, because it's useful to help describe these things to you. But it's not the end of the world if you don't remember what they're called. It's just important that your writing includes these sorts of things. You can see that this sentence is more interesting because it's not just the crew looked, it's the crew looked around and how are they looking around in fear and dread. We're adding these extra bits of information. Here's another interesting few sentences. Next morning, the crew were worried. Next mornings are fronted adverbial. It's got a comma. The sentence there, the main clause is the crew were worried, but we've added next morning to tell us when. They couldn't be sure, but the day before it seemed that they had numbered more. You could put the day before it seemed they'd numbered more as a sentence. They couldn't be sure could be its own sentence. Wouldn't make much sense on its own. So what about if I was given a bit of a sentence that just didn't make sense? Down into the deep dark depths of the briny sea. This is a sort of sentence I have been seeing in your books. It's lovely. You've put deep dark depths, briny sea. Briny means salty sea. It sounds really interesting. It's got down, it's got prepositional in it, down and into. It's got lovely expanded noun phrase, the deep dark depths of the briny sea. But nothing happens in it. It's not a sentence. It's just a phrase at best. It's really interesting, but it needs something more. So your work today is going to be, I'm going to give you bits of a sentence like this that are not a sentence on its own, and you need to work out something to add to that sentence just to make it more interesting. Well, not interesting, to make it make sense. So, down into the deep dark depths of the briny sea, well what happened? Something could be dropped, something could be thrown, somebody could swim. They could look. What shall I choose to do? There's no right or wrong answer as long as something happens. So I could have the crew. It could be a sentence about the crew looking. The crew looked down into the deep, dark depths of the briny sea. Now I could add something at the end instead of that. I could be a bit more poetic and put down into the deep, dark depth of the briny sea. The crew looked in dread. Bit more poetic. Down into the deep, dark depths of the briny sea, the crew looked in dread. It doesn't have to be the crew looking. It could be a completely different thing happening in that sentence. I could have chest sank like a rock down into the deep, dark depths of the briny sea. Now, what's important here is, for the sake of this game anyway, not for the sake of life, but for the sake of this game, down into the depths of the deep, dark, briny sea stays exactly as it is. Oops, that's not a highlighter. Down into the deep, dark depths of the briny sea stays the same. Down into the depth. Whoops, what happened there? Oh, I zoomed, that's what I did. Down into the deep, dark depths of the briny sea stays the same. Down into the deep, dark depths of the briny sea stays the same. Oh, full stop on to that. Okay, we're just adding a little bit more so that this sentence makes sense. Let's do another example. With a massive crash that rang around their heads like thunder. It's got a bit of simile in there, like thunder. It's not just a crash, it's a massive crash. It's got a lot of the things that you are having to add to your sentences that you are adding to your sentences, just sometimes forgetting the sentence. So, what could happen with a massive crash that rang around their heads like thunder? It could be the tentacle hits the ship, or the monster's jaws close, or a cannon fires at the monster. What could I have happening? I'm going to have the monster's jaws closing. So, the monster's jaws slammed shut. Whoops, I can't put shut there, I put sut. Slammed shut with a massive crash that rang around their heads like thunder. Okay, now I have a thing that happens. The monster's jaws are slamming shut. However, I could do this the other way around. I could put, with a massive crash that rang around their heads like thunder, the monster's jaws slammed shut. That would also work, with a comma in between them. Or I could have something else entirely. I could have the crew fired their cannon. with a massive crash that rang around their heads like thunder. The point is, I'm not changing this bit of the sentence. That's not the point of this game. The point of this game is you keep the bit that I've given you and you add around it to make it make sense. It's not about colouring things and colour coding it and knowing what all the different bits are called. It's just about recognising that what I've given you doesn't make sense on its own and making it into a sentence and make sense on its own. The idea then is that when you go back and you read your work in the future, you can recognise a sentence that isn't really a sentence, that doesn't make sense on its own, and then you can make it make sense. Now, this is what I've given you for your go. I've given you a bit of a sentence. I've put dots before and dots after because I'm not telling you whether you've got to add a bit at the beginning. I'm not telling you whether you need to add a bit at the end. You might want to add a bit at the beginning and the end. The bit that you add might be short, the bit that you add might be long. But all that matters is at the end of it, you have written a sentence and you have this bit in it. So as he stared in horror, you could add anything to the beginning or the end or both of that. It could be the captain's wooden leg dropped off as he stared in horror, or as he stared in horror, the captain's wooden leg dropped off, or as he stared in horror, the monster bit the ship in half, or the monster bit the ship in half as he stared in horror. Doesn't matter what you add as long as it makes sense. And just like that, so what are you going to add there? You might need to add something at the beginning and at the end of that one. The captain looked, and just like that, the monster bit his leg off. It's up to you. Down onto the wooden deck. The monkey jumped down onto the wooden deck. Down onto the wooden deck the monkey jumped. With an amazing backflip and a somersault, the monkey jumped down onto the wooden deck and ran off. You can add something at the beginning and the end. With a thunderous bang, the crew fired their cannon. With a thunderous bang, a tentacle smashed a mast from the ship. A tentacle smashed a mast from the ship with a thunderous bang. You get the idea. You just have to write me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sentences that have got those bits in them. Those bits don't change. Those bits have to appear in the sentence exactly like that. You are either adding at the beginning or you are adding at the end, but you are not changing that part. More importantly, you are not misspelling a single word that is in that list because they're written there for you. There's no reason to not spell them correctly. I would also like to see some very good handwriting, please. Okay, any questions? Message one of us. Right, I said I'd tell you a joke. It's not a very good one. It's a grammar joke, so they're not supposed to be hilarious. Do you remember I said that this is a subject? Sorry, the object. No, the subject. And this is the object. And the subject is who the sentence is about, the thing that's doing the thing. And the object is the other bit. The joke is, a mum says to her little boy, you need to go and tidy your room. You need to go and tidy your room. You is the subject, and your room, in this case, is the object. And the little boy suddenly says, Mum, oh, Mum, come on, can we change? I don't want to talk about this all the time. Can we change the subject? And the mum goes, all right, your room needs to be tidied by you. Now the sentence is about your room. You are the object. So she changed the subject. She made the subject your room and not you. So when the boy said, can we change the subject? His mum did, but she was still talking about tidying. See, it's a grammar joke. They're kind of funny, but not particularly.